Welcome to the Deep Dive,
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive. And RJ, we beat the Deep Dive curse by waiting a day.
We did it.
I had a gut feel on Sunday night. I was like, we should wait, I think. And sure enough, we were able to beat the Deep Dive curse as the news we were all waiting for happened late yesterday afternoon. And that is that the Seattle Kraken have their second ever head coach in franchise history, and it is Dan Bylsma, RJ.
That's right. I mean, the news came across yesterday. I'm so glad we waited and trusted our gut. We didn't fully prepare for it. I mean, I was out rollerblading in Bothell, so I had to rollerblade back as fast as I possibly could. But yes, the news coming out, perfect timing too, with us having plans to go down and see Game 2 of the Coachella Valley series on Friday. So that's going to be really fun. But today, Dan Bylsma, he actually did fly up to Seattle to do the big announcement press conference. And so we heard from Dan, we heard from Ron Francis, the GM, we heard from the owner, Samantha Holloway, and he was introduced to everybody formally as the Kraken's next head coach.
Yeah, so can't wait to dig into all that good stuff. Of course, though, first we got to mention Queen Anne Beer Hall, a wonderful sponsor for the podcast, like we do each and every week. And I'm always so thankful to have them, especially for like big weeks like this, because especially like in the fall when I'm up there, RJ, like the big news happens, we can go like to the beer hall and talk with people about it and stuff like afterwards. It'd be like so much fun.
Yeah, definitely. And also this past week, they had some cool stuff. I'm sorry you had to miss it, Dylan, but they had the Brewers Wing competition where breweries would, compete for the best wing sauce. And I know you would have loved to be there for that, Perfect. But it was pretty great.
Yeah, would have been perfect. Talking about perfect things though, boy, doesn't Dan seem like the perfect hire for this team, given where this team was at. And there's lots of things that make me think that after listening to the press conference that he had. But the first thing that just jumped out at me is, one, he's so well spoken. This gets me every time I go to Coachella Valley, all that stuff, but he is fantastic at answering questions at a podium. And then two, just how perfect this entire offseason has been so far for the Kraken and the organization, right? Like, we knew that there needed to be change, and there needed to be change in a variety of areas. One, they needed to be more accessible. They've addressed that with the TV deal. They needed maybe kind of a new culture, right, in and around things, and boy, does Dan really address that. And so really the only thing left to address, and they can't yet until free agency opens up, is just like kind of maybe the roster, adding in a little bit more talent and stuff. But so far, 2 for 3.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you go back 2 weeks, right? We had our episode profiling all the different head coach candidates. I think we went over 18 different coaching options in that episode. Yeah, it was very thorough. Actually, more options than the Kraken went over. Of course, I wouldn't expect them to interview 18 different guys. Actually, as Ron Francis said today, they interviewed 5 different coaching candidates. But we went over 18. And you look back at what we said when we were talking about Dan Bylsma, that, barring like a John Cooper becoming available or something crazy like that, we agreed that if he wanted the job, it should be his. And turns out he did want the job, and it is his.
Yeah. So I'm really pumped about that. A lot of the stuff that he talked about in this press conference gave me a lot of hope for things like that. But let's go ahead and start with like that kind of the news aspects of it. So like you did just mention they interviewed 5 candidates. Dan was obviously one of them. Do we know definitively who the other 4 people were?
That was not confirmed today, although we can kind of piece together things based on the reporting. So obviously Dan Bylsma was one of the candidates. Jay Leach had to have been another one, given the rumors that came out. Todd McClellan, we know, interviewed. So that's number 3. I believe Joe Sacco was also confirmed. So that's 4. And then the 5th one, maybe Dean Evison, because his name was in the conversation as well. That's who I would guess would be the 5.
That was my guess for it as well. So that aspect of it came together. The other thing that I think kind of came together here and was starting to develop certainly over like this last week, which was, hey, maybe the reason the Kraken haven't made a move here as all these other teams are making their hires is because they were waiting for Dan and waiting for the Coachella Valley run that they're currently on to end. I think you mentioned, right, he's got to go back down there tomorrow, come down here, I should say, to kick off the Western Conference final against the Milwaukee Admirals and Carl Taylor, coach we had brought up plenty during the coaching search for the Kraken. But the reason that maybe we're getting the announcement today is because yesterday the news was kind of starting to leak, right? Like it was getting out that this was happening, and I think the Kraken knew they needed to make a formal announcement, go ahead and get it out there, and try to do that before that Western Conference Final series started for the Firebirds, because you don't want to do that mid-series or something like that. Have it be all awkward. Everybody knows this is the coach. You can't really introduce him. He's in the middle of a series, all that kind of stuff. So I don't know that this was necessarily the timeline that the Kraken wanted for all this, RJ, but I think they did a pretty good job, all things considered.
I agreed. I don't know that they had too much of a choice with the word getting out. And once it gets out, you have to say something. You can't really deny it for upwards of a month, potentially,
Yeah.
With Bylsma having a playoff run. But yeah, they did it well. It timed out well that it was before the series starts against Milwaukee. And yeah, I thought the timing was pretty good. It was a really well done event, too. They hosted in the Kraken locker room, the announcement, which they haven't really done anything like that before. So it was kind of a cool setup as well.
Yeah, I noticed that because I was like, oh, I know where that is. I thought that was a really interesting setup, and it looked nice. I thought it, you know what? I'm just gonna say it. Probably the most like smooth, like press conference type thing that the Kraken have really done. Certainly of like that level, it ran really really well. I was happy about that.
Yeah, I would say so, and I think I've been to just about everything of that magnitude that they've done. So yeah, I think this was the best one yet.
Yeah, long way from like all the original stuff with all the COVID protocols and everything that made it difficult that first off season there. All right. Is there anything else like news wise about this that we want to talk about before we start getting into the staff questions?
No, I mean, the remaining news aspects, I think, are related to the staff.
Yeah.
And because it's not just Bylsma, there will be a whole coaching staff that's going to help him. And then, of course, the questions about what's happening in Coachella Valley, too. So I think we get right into that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the people that were retained, or at least are still hanging around after Dave Haxtell and Paul McFarland were dismissed. That's Jay Leach and Dave Lowry. And it sounded like Dan during that press conference, talked about how he's looking forward to communicating with them and kind of seeing where they're at and evaluating them as far as being part of his staff with the Kraken.
Right. So no concrete decisions have been made yet. No one was ready to commit to anything. This is still part of the process that they're going through. But yes, Bylsma said that both Jay Leach and Dave Lowry are, and I think the quote is, individuals I'd like to talk with going forward. So they're going to have those conversations, and they're going to see whether they want to return and what the whole idea is going to be with the rest of the NHL staff. He also did talk about the possibility of adding another assistant coach, which I think they're going to want to do. Francis talked about it a little bit later, not part of the presser, where he made it seem like that's something they're definitely going to do. They're going to look at options for another assistant coach, which makes sense because they had one in Paul McFarland who they let go of. So there's going to be a replacement for that, probably somebody who's going to handle the power play. As for potential candidates for that job, Francis said they're going to do a wider search and look for people, within and outside the organization as well. But Bylsma did say that he has talked with his assistants in Coachella Valley, that being Jess Campbell and Stu Bickle, and they have been part of those conversations. So he is considering those two for that role on his staff.
Yeah, and I know that drew a lot of attention. Obviously, everybody who follows us probably follows the Kraken pretty closely, the Kraken organization, the Firebirds. We all, are huge fans of Jess Campbell and what she's been able to do working with players. Dan brought it up during that press conference when asked about her, the work she's been able to do with guys like Ty Cartier and all of them down there in Coachella Valley. We know from whenever we talk to players, either in Coachella Valley or when they're up with the Kraken, if you ask them anything about working with Jess Campbell and how she coaches them, I mean, it is nothing but positives, especially about how she connects with them and is able to kind of build that relationship and help them along, particularly when it comes to skating, coaching, all of that kind of stuff. So I think she would obviously be, a big boon to add to the NHL coaching staff. But I will say this, just to get this out there right now, RJ, I think I would personally rather her be the head coach of the Firebirds next, rather than being an assistant with the Kraken, because of all the great work she does developing young players and developing guys like Ty Cartier, Logan Morrison as they come in as undrafted guys, the work she's done with the drafted players that they have, and how we're going to really start seeing a lot more of them joining that Firebirds team over the, for next season and the year after that. Personally, I think because she's such a good developer of young players, I would rather see her down there as the head coach and kind of overseeing everything there than being part of the Kraken system. But it's not my call to make, and obviously either way, it's going to be historic for her.
Right. And I agree with you completely on that. We've talked about how important it is. I mean, look, Dan being named the Kraken head coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
How important that position is of the head coach of the AHL team. And having some continuity there, I think would be huge because player development has been huge for the Kraken and will continue to be even bigger for the Kraken as a lot of these draft picks that they've started to accumulate start to come through the system. And you want somebody who's really good with development there. If it's not Jess, I think you'd really have a big hole to fill in a very important spot that would all of a sudden be a question mark. So I think that's probably the best spot for her, even though I think she could do either job just fine. She did handle the power play in Coachella Valley. Paul McFarland's responsibility was the power play. So of course there are those parallels there, but I think the Coachella Valley head coaching job, it just makes so much sense. In fact, I'd be a little surprised if that wasn't where she ended up next season. So I think that's probably the way it's going to go. Also, too, if you're looking at it from her perspective, assuming both, if both were options on the table, and if your ultimate goal is to be an NHL head coach, which if you're in coaching, that's, what most people's ultimate goal is, right? Then I think taking the Firebirds head coaching job is actually a better career move than being an assistant at the NHL level, because it gives you that head coaching experience. She already has the experience as an assistant, and especially in the skill development, all that stuff. So it would be just another area of her resume that she could fill out that she doesn't really have the experience with yet.
Yeah, exactly. But I know that's been getting a lot of national coverage, even on Twitter, the comments that Dan had to say about her during that press conference. I mean, that's going to be it really on the staff, right? Because I have to imagine with Dan, it's going to take a little while before he's going to really be able to be a huge part of the interviewing process for that last assistant role and everything, just because he's got he's got a series he needs to shift focus to that starts tomorrow, and then potentially a final after that, the Calder Cup final after that. So I think this will probably be the last time we hear anything about any of that stuff for a couple weeks, if not more. But I mean, unless you got any more kind of behind the scenes afterwards.
No, not really. I mean, well, aside from talking with Ron a little bit afterwards, I mean, I think the smart thing to do would be to name Jess the head coach in Coachella Valley and really look for a power play specialist type of guy as an assistant coach for the Kraken staff.
Yeah.
And, hearing the way he talked about it, it sounds like he's probably on that same page. So again, I don't want to, confirm anything because he certainly didn't, but I would imagine reading between the lines, that's the way they're going to go. But yeah, as far as Dan's mindset today, I mean, he was definitely enjoying this moment and all the importance of it, but you could tell his mind was, I think, more than 50% still in Coachella Valley and the playoff series that they got to go try and win. So, which is what you want out of a coach. You don't want him completely forgetting that responsibility there. He even joked that he's like, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with you all, but really getting back to Coachella Valley. So I'm just going to leave right now and get on a flight. Yeah. So he even joked about that. So I think that's kind of where his mind is at right now.
It was a very good introduction for Kraken fans into Dan's personality. And with that, what you see there is what it is. That, he is himself all the time. That is very much who he is. And yeah, I would think that even if internally they know the plan for the next Firebirds coach, it makes zero sense to say anything about it now or confirm it or do anything with it while that team is still playing and while Dan is still the coach, right? It would be very awkward to be like, hey, while we're going into the Western Conference Finals, by the way, this person's going to be the next coach once this guy leaves. It's already kind of awkward enough that you have a guy that is not going to be there afterwards, still coaching the team. So yeah, I'm unsurprised that nobody would be looking to go on the record with any sort of confirmation about the plans there. I mean, we could go ahead and start shifting over into Coach Dan and his coaching style, both on and off the ice. I think the big thing about this hire for me, is there's been two things that really stand out from it. And one of them you already kind of touched on, and that's the player development side of things. Obviously, Dan has done a great job at the AHL of helping develop these players, and some of which we've already seen with the Kraken. And it really does feel like that is the direction that the Kraken and Ron Francis kind of wanted to go with this. You know what I mean? There are, I'll be frank, right? There are probably other better win now coaches out there that you could have gone and tried to bring in. But this to me signals that they are very much all about kind of that building from within, focusing on developing young players, particularly the young guys they already have, like Matty Beniers, Shane Wright. And I do wonder, this really, to me, RJ, was like a signal that Francis is invested in the future of kind of what he's already built upon. I don't know. I mean, do you think that maybe means he's got more job security than we've been acting like he has?
Today made me ask that question because I don't think he would be able to do that without ownership's backing. And thankfully we had the owner, Samantha Holloway, there at the presser as well today. And I did kind of take note of something that she said with Dan and talking about his credentials in player development, where she talked about that, how important that is, looking at the team even from a long-term perspective, having somebody that how important player development is. And then she said, in addition, of course, to turning things around right away and winning right now, but she started with the player development, the long-term development side. So maybe ownership is giving a little less pressure than we would have originally thought on Ron Francis, and he might have a little bit more leash than we thought.
Yeah, and I mean,
if you're reading between the lines.
Yes, and it's that, or it's at the very least that maybe ownership was kind of involved in this decision and they value the long-term outlook, whether it's going to be, even Dan and Ron long-term or whatever. It was very clear based on everything she said and really just this hiring in general that they are taking the longer-term approach, right? They want to focus on the future and the development of this. And to be honest, RJ, I mean, she mentioned how they want to continue to build the fan base, which I thought was kind of an important key thing that was mentioned as part of that from the ownership side of things. And I think that that's another reason why we see Dan here, and why I think ownership definitely would have been on board with him, is because he is like the ultimate culture hire, but he's also the best person from coaching staff, management, whatever, that the Kraken have ever had at being able to go out there and connect to fans, right? Like they now have a voice and somebody who could go out there into the community, talk with people, and be that connection from management / coaching to the community that didn't really exist before, but Dan lives for that kind of stuff. And so I also thought that was kind of part of this. Was I think it all kind of goes in with the stuff I had talked about earlier, this whole offseason and what it was about, which was kind of maybe changing the culture internally a little bit, but also really that focus on establishing the brand, establishing the organization. And you went out there and you got a very personable guy who's never going to say no to somebody, who's always going to take a picture with a kid, who's always going to communicate with fans, who's going to have personality when he's talking to the media, be very lively, joke a lot, all of that good stuff, at a time when the team really needed that. And they especially, needed it going into the new TV deal that they have set up, where the team is going to be so much more accessible to people, and you're going to want somebody who is warm and welcoming and can help bring in new fans. This just really felt like it kind of just went in line with everything that, realistically ownership would have wanted this to be.
Yeah, and that's something we didn't really talk about a lot a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at different coaching candidates, but it is something that is relevant for the Kraken right now. And if you look at kind of the job description that Dan had going to Coachella Valley, it's beyond what a normal coach has to do. It's not just the X's and O's, the on the ice stuff, the culture off the ice. They had to build a fan base from scratch. And I cannot think of a possible better way they could have done it in Coachella Valley than what they've ended up with, right? As we're about to go see later this week, just how crazy that building gets and how amazing that fan base is. And for better or worse, I think that is actually still part of the job description for a Kraken coach now. Even after 3 seasons, they still have some work to do as far as growing a fan base. And the team has started doing that. The ownership started doing that with the TV deal we mentioned earlier. But now that the eyes are going to be on the team in the way that they should have been, but now will be, you need a coach who's going to take advantage of that. You need a player group who's going to take advantage of that, and wins are going to be the number one thing. But having somebody who brings that extra personality, that extra friendliness, is going to help quite a bit.
Yeah. Let's talk about a different off-ice aspect of what he's going to bring to the organization here. And then we will touch on the on-ice stuff. Don't worry, everybody. And get into like the roster, how we think this might affect the roster and all that kind of stuff. But the other thing is, and I've mentioned culture several times, but I think it is worth noting that they never mentioned the word culture once during that press conference. However, it was there, like everything. They danced around the word as much as possible without saying it. But one of the things that I want to talk about was, because this was very much the focal point of a lot of what Dan had to say, which was, his work and the stuff that he's done since he last coached in the NHL to change his approach to coaching, to coach modern day athletes versus what athletes were like 10, 20 years ago, whether it was back when he was coaching, 10 years ago or playing 20 years ago, and how important personal connections are and how important it is to build that relationship with the players, and how much that has been his focus with the Firebirds, being given that opportunity to be a head coach, even though it was at the AHL level, not the NHL level. You could just hear it in his voice, RJ, how grateful he was to have that opportunity to kind of maybe correct some of the mistakes that he felt like he had previously, or at least grow and have that opportunity to grow and develop as a person, with another opportunity to kind of do this. And I thought that was really important because, we've talked a little bit about his history and we've talked about like some of the struggles in Buffalo, but that was the struggle in Buffalo, was that a lot of the players felt that he was too rigid in the system and that they couldn't connect with him. And this was to the point where even in a John Vogel Buffalo News article, before he was hired, the general manager at the time, Ted Murray, was talking about how, Dan, again, was still the coach, although he was fired less than a week later. He didn't talk and get to know the players well enough. And that was kind of why things never really developed in Buffalo the way that everybody kind of was hoping it would. And it really did seem like Dan took that to heart. And he really wanted to change and make sure that if he was ever given that opportunity again to be a head coach again, he was not going to make that same mistake. And we can certainly say from everything we've seen with the Firebirds and from what anybody has seen with the Firebirds, that has not been the case. Everybody with the Firebirds organization loves him. He has made that connection with the players that is very, very evident. The players talk about it. He's going to do the same with the Kraken here. But it was very, very interesting to hear somebody being brought in at their introductory press conference, RJ, to be a head coach at the highest level of their sport, talk about that and talk about developing those personal relationships and the power of communication, the thing I was saying should be most important, how much of that was, and to kind of be a little bit reflective on maybe, some of the issues he'd had in the past. I thought that was very, very interesting, and it says a lot about his character that he would bring it up as much as he did.
Right. It was music to your ears, I'm sure, Dylan, as much as you talk about communication. And I really appreciated how he kind of shed some light on the journey that he's had over the last 4 years and how it's led him to this point. That's what he said. The last 4 years kind of brought him to this point and reignited his desire to be at the NHL level. And remember, Dylan, that's something we were wondering about. Does he even want the job, and what's his ultimate goal here? And he said 4 years ago, I needed to discover the joy of coaching again, rediscover relationships with the players. And I think coming off that stint in Buffalo, as you mentioned, the way it went, that's going to be, it's going to hold someone down, right? You're going to be thinking about that too. And especially, did I just burn my last shot of being an NHL head coach because I didn't communicate enough, or I did this, and this wrong? But finding a way to kind of have that reset. And remember, he started off taking that assistant job in Charlotte. And he did admit he kind of had his eye on maybe proving to the organization that he'd be the right person to lead Coachella Valley and be the coach for that team. And he was ultimately able to do that. And we've talked a lot in the past about coaches who, it'll be his third NHL head coaching opportunity. We've talked about retread coaches. We've kind of lamented that a little bit, but I think we are starting to see something in the NHL where you have coaches that things have not gone well for them in past stints in the NHL, and they kind of have this awakening moment, right? Paul Maurice is probably the biggest example of that, most prominent example right now, where you have a coach who's been around for a while, and then they rediscover their love for the game, their love for coaching, and their love for the kind of relationships that make coaching special. And I think Dan Bylsma over the last 4 years has kind of had that moment, and he's a different guy than he was in those two stints with Pittsburgh and with Buffalo. And I appreciate him kind of going through the story and explaining how he got there and got to this point.
Yeah, I think it's really important. We've certainly talked a lot about that on Red Glares, right, over at on patreon.com/EmeraldCityHockey, about the coaches that are that way. Paul Maurice definitely brought up, even Peter Laviolette with the Rangers this season, right? A lot looser than maybe he has been in the past. And I do wonder if I think there is an element of the joy of coaching, the joy of the relationships you build with the players and with the other people around the hockey world. That is a very small, close-knit community, and how that all goes down. And I do think that some of that also comes from learning how to talk to the modern day players and the way modern day stuff kind of has to be set up. And even Dan referenced, like, you know, it's different than like back when I was a player, right? Like the way coaches communicate to players is just different than what it was back then. And I think he kind of alluded to, he was continuing to talk to players the way he had been talked to, but the players were just different now, and that wasn't the way to do it anymore. And so, yeah, it's been really interesting. It's been interesting to see the coaches that have been able to make that change. And you look at the coaches that have made that change, and they have found success. Paul Maurice has found success in Florida in a way that I don't know that he would have had his personality not really changed, had he not grown and evolved as a person and a coach. Laviolette with the Rangers, kind of same situation. Obviously, those two teams battling it out in the Eastern Conference Finals right now. And I think that that's going to do Dan a lot of good in this stint with the Kraken. And it's also important to remember, I could totally see how somebody could lose the passion for coaching after what he kind of had to go through, because you come in, right, coming from coaching the AHL level mid-year, you take a Penguins team that had been to the Cup Finals the year before and lost, you take them and you win the Stanley Cup, and then you're there for 5 more years in which you don't get to a Cup Final. And you have the pressure of a market that expects a championship each year. You have the pressure of management and ownership that's expecting a championship each year. Every year you're trying to kind of go through and do the post-mortem and try to figure out where it went wrong. You've got, you know, the best player in the world on your team and all that kind of stuff. I could see why it would become just stressful, right? Like there's not a lot of room for fun there anymore when you know the regular season ultimately doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we can go the entire month of March without losing a game because we got bounced in the second round again, right? Like, and how you would kind of lose that element of what made it special, and then you immediately go into a Buffalo situation that, keep in mind, that was their first year coming out of when they really tanked hard to try to get McDavid, and then they didn't get McDavid. But that was a roster that was just not good. They were trying to build something around Jack Eichel, but it was a mess. That whole Buffalo system was a mess. You had lots of stuff going on around you that I'm sure as a coach you feel like you don't have control over, and you're trying to make it work with a lot of different people pulling in different directions. And I could see easily how somebody could leave that, right? That being your life for 7-8 years in a row, and being like, yeah, this sucks, right? Like this is rough. I'm not enjoying this. I'm not happy with this. I'm not living the dream anymore. And then being able to go and refine that, and very happy for him to have refound that. And I think that that's what a lot of us, especially those of us that had kind of followed him and knew him before the Firebirds and everything, why it was so great for us to see him with the Firebirds and the personality come back, and how happy he was and how present he was, something he mentioned during this press conference too, right? Just taking it day at a time, series at a time, game at a time, all of that kind of stuff. It's been really, really great to see that from him. And I think those are also important lessons that people in leadership positions need to have that kind of awareness. And also specifically when coaching and communicating to younger people, when coaching developing players at the AHL level, or now with the Kraken when he's going to be talking with guys like Matty Beniers, Shane Wright. He can help them have perspective on all of this when it feels stressful, when the grind of an 82 game season feels like it's too much. He can kind of talk to them and try to impart some of that wisdom upon them. And I think that is something that this organization probably needed after everything they just went through.
Yeah, and it resonates with veterans and young players alike, too. And that's one of the things that Francis said was really important to him, is that you look at that Firebirds roster year one, they had a very veteran team for an AHL squad, right? They had a lot of vets there, and he was able to lead them to within an overtime of winning the Calder Cup. And then this year, you have a much younger team, and he's been able to lead that team to the conference finals, or maybe better. We'll see how well they do. But it really is like a message and a style that does seem to resonate with everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be good. You talked about how players are going to, they're going to know what his expectations for them are. I think that's important, that communication thing. And then the last thing, at least for me, on the off-ice stuff, RJ, before we transition to the on-ice stuff, he mentioned 3 players by name And I thought that it was sort of specific that he chose these three players by name as far as who he had talked to, because he had talked about how he hasn't quite been able to like reach out and do the whole new coaching thing, communicate with all the players and stuff, just because he is still in the middle of a playoff run.
Yeah.
But he did mention communicating with and talking about communicating with and moving forward and stuff. Jared McCann, Jordan Eberle, and Matty Beniers. And I thought that was a very interesting group of names. I don't know if it kind of hit you the same way it hit me, RJ.
It did.
But I was like, that is the group, right? Like that is kind of the leadership group of this team that when I think of it and when I think of everything that kind of happened last year, I think that is the group that we will see moving forward, kind of be that kind of core group of leaders and culture makers within that locker room.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, you've got Jordan Eberle, of course, who's kind of the de facto captain really the last year. And of course, he's going to be part of that. Jared McCann, who I was glad to see his name mentioned in there too, because he wasn't somebody who had a letter, but we've talked about this plenty. A voice that was frustrated with the losing and probably one we'd like to hear from a little bit more. And that maybe the players should even hear from a little bit more when things aren't going well. And then, of course, Matty Beniers, Calder winner, future of the franchise, long-term at center. Getting him right and communicating with him and making sure he's on the right track has to be priority number one. And so, those three names made a lot of sense. And it was, I think it was, kind of that introduction almost that this is the leadership group going forward.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be good, especially for McCann and Matty, right? Like that's kind of something that gives them a little bit more of like, hey, you can talk in this locker room. Right, like whether you've got a letter on your chest or not, like you guys are valued and you are a part of this stuff. And it's important to note, like Dan comes up and was in charge of the development camps each year. Matty Beniers, big part of those first couple development camps that were had right after the draft in July. And we know, I mean, Matty was like running things during those dev camps and stuff. So I'm sure him and Dan had some good conversations during those times. And I'm sure that'll carry over. I'm also wasn't surprised too, because he said some players had reached out to him. And then when he said the names, I was like, oh, Matty was one of those for sure. Because we know Matty reaches out to everybody, trying to keep that team group chat alive.
Group chat alive, yes.
He's trying. So good on Matty Beniers there. Was there anything else about the off-ice aspects of things, RJ, that you wanted to touch on before we move towards the on-ice stuff?
No, I mean, I think we pretty much covered the off-ice. I mean, it's just it's a cool journey for Dan. I think he approaches it with the right mindset, but that isn't going to matter unless the on-ice stuff can be brought together too. It's a whole picture, right? And so I'm eager to get into that with you because I know you kind of follow this stuff more closely than I do. You've gotten a good look more recently than I have too at Firebirds games and the system and all that stuff. So as we get into the on-ice stuff though, I wanted to mention, I mean, you probably had it in your notes too, but he was asked about this pretty directly about, what's going to change or stay the same as far as the on-ice style of the team. Didn't go into any specifics as you would expect from any coach. But Francis, I think, did mention that, a lot of it's going to be the same, but they are going to look at some different things offensively to kind of tweak and do differently than what they were doing last year.
Yeah. And I don't know if I was just expecting him to say this or if he actually said this, but did Dan say something about them being a little bit more aggressive?
I think I heard the word aggressive once, and I was trying to find it on my notes, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah, but that is how the Firebirds play, right? And I would expect that from him. I've talked about when we talked about all of the coaching candidates, kind of the systems that he runs. He likes to run that 2-1-2 with the Firebirds a lot. Send 2 forecheckers out there, really try to pressure the opposing team. Don't let them get a transitional attack going, right? Because they're going to have to make a safe pass, sometimes even lateral or even backwards if possible, just to avoid the pressure that his teams are going to come at them with. And it really can help delay the attack. And as we're seeing more and more teams at the NHL level try to use speed to come through the neutral zone and develop something, I think that's going to be really important to have that aggressive thing. I think the Kraken have a good roster for it. So I would expect to see that on ice. The big thing for me, though, on ice, RJ, and this is very much one player specific, but do you think there was an element of his hiring here that was, we want and potentially, what they would say need Shane Wright to be at his absolute best? And who has he been at his absolute best under? Dan Bylsma. And so as Shane Wright is going to be coming to the NHL, what do? You bring the coach that has brought everything good out in him, and you make him the head coach at the NHL level. You think there was an element of that went into the decision making, like I do, RJ?
I think so. I think you could say there's probably a little bit, at least, of that went into it. And true, if you're Ron Franson, you're looking at the roster situation, as we've done, on the podcast, Armchair GM streams, all this stuff, and you look at how this team plans to line up for next year. And I know they have room to make big additions, and you never know what kind of moves they might pull. But unless you pull the rabbit out of the hat and get a true difference maker, which we both agree is kind of unlikely given what the market is, you are relying on Shane Wright to be a major offensive producer for you if you want to get back into the playoffs. There's no way around that. You're going to need him to produce quite a bit. And yeah, if you take the coach that has certainly gotten the most out of him recently, that's going to help you with that goal. And that actually, just looking at the on ice production, like that might be the most important part of next season. Even more important than getting Matty Beniers right is having Shane Wright produce for you in a way that's going to make up for some of the goals that you lost last season.
Yeah, and focus on the long-term development of Shane Wright, right? Like, because obviously Matty and Shane are going to be the pieces moving forward, and then you could also argue like the 8th overall pick they're going to have this year is going to be a part of that as well. But if the Kraken are committed to kind of building things in-house and this investment into the future that a lot of this coaching hiring has signaled and we talked about already, I mean, Shane Wright is the most exciting, like most highest potential offensively, guy you have, right? Like of anybody who's going to put up superstar level production, goal and point production, he is the one. And so, yeah, you kind of need to do whatever you can to make sure that he develops, that he builds confidence at the NHL level, that he's able to go out there and become that player for you, because if he doesn't, it's going to be hard to fill that void externally.
Your core just isn't good enough if he's not.
Right. And so, yeah.
And what's the one thing that we've been saying since that kind of nightmare of a junior can't play in the AHL season back and forth? What's the one thing we've been saying that Shane Wright absolutely needs? Consistency.
Consistency, yes.
He just needs some stability, right? And he got it this season.
Yeah.
And this continues that stability forward, because as nice as it was that he was able to get a whole year basically in the same spot this year, if you go to the Kraken next year and they have an external hire who's a new coach and new systems to do everything you have to learn, that's another speed bump on the road to his development.
Mm-hmm. And it's going to be somebody who maybe isn't going to trust him as much, right? He's a young guy coming in. Let's start him on the 4th line, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. We know Dan trusts him. Right, this year with the Firebirds, Shane has been used a ton. He'll be double shifted when they need him to, like all that kind of stuff. Like Dan absolutely trusts Shane Wright, and I do think that him being the head coach probably gives Shane the fastest, timeline wise trajectory to a top 6 role. I mean, I think it's going to be on the table for him if he does well through camp and preseason, just to start off the season there, particularly if the Kraken don't bring in anybody else down the middle. They kind of have the spot there anyway. But I think that's going to be big for him as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was on the Fantasy Hockey Life podcast last month, and they're asking me about Shane Wright and his outlook. And I was saying so much of this is going to depend on the coach. Like, I can't really tell you much without knowing who the next coach is going to be. But if I could go back on the show and just update them, I would say, okay, be bullish on Shane Wright and that role, because this is the best case scenario for him coach wise.
Yeah. And that is going to be good. That's going to be something to watch. What do you think this means for the roster next season, though? In addition to Shane Wright, we knew Shane Wright was always going to be on the Kraken. Do you think that this means we see more guys on the Kraken from this Firebirds team, this current Firebirds team? Like, do you think we see Logan Morrison, Ryan Winterton maybe given opportunities at the beginning of the year? Do you think that kind of plays in? I mean, we know that was maybe part of the plan anyway, long term, and that goes into why they didn't re-sign the 4th line from last year for this year, was because they were going to have to sign him to multi-year deals. It would kind of throw off the trajectory that the team was looking for now for this offseason. But do you think we see maybe 1 or 2 additional guys from the Firebirds on this roster rather than external depth signings, just because, hey, they're going to know the system? We know they perform well in the system. Maybe they can go ahead and kind of produce at above 4th line value for this team if Dan is going to be the coach.
I'll say this. I don't think this changes anything because I think that was probably the organizational plan all along. And also you look at it, from the armchair GM standpoint, right? And you kind of have some expensive depth pieces that maybe weren't contributing as much as they could have last season. And you saw what guys like Morrison and Winterton were able to do in those roles instead. And if you watched the games and saw how they did, which, I'm sure everybody in the organization did, you saw how valuable those guys could be and that were ready and they could step into those roles. So I think we'll see it, but I think we would have seen it anyway.
All right. Very good. Very good. Otherwise, I mean, I'm on ice stuff. Like those were really like the big things for me. Like it's going to be a more aggressive style. We're going to see the team be more aggressive. Certainly on the forecheck, they're going to be more aggressive. I'm going to be interested to see how the defense goes because like Coachella Valley can sometimes run more of a zone style defense in their own zone. I'm not a big fan of that. It also doesn't necessarily line up with how aggressive they are forechecking, but maybe it's because you need to play it then a little safe in case the aggressive forechecking goes bad. You don't have as many guys back. It's a lot of coaching stuff, and I can't wait to be able to be in a position where I can talk with Coach Dan Bylsma about that kind of stuff. But I'm curious to see how the defensive stuff goes, particularly if Jay Leach is still there, kind of what improvements we might see from the defensive core that's going to be, basically the same from last year, right? I mean, it's going to be Justin Schultz will probably leave because his contract expired and then, get one new person in. But like Riker Evans, how he's going to continue to develop, again, somebody Dan trusted a lot with the Firebirds. Be interesting to see what kind of role he's going to have in mind for him now at the NHL level.
Right. I mean, we saw Evans get some workhorse type minutes with Vince Dunn out last season. I think we could really see his ice time be even higher than some people might project next season because we know Dan trusts him and we know that he's familiar with him in that role. Yeah, I'm interested too to see how the defense shakes out, especially if Jay Leach is retained, because it's going to be a different system that he's teaching and coaching guys. And so that's going to be an adjustment for Leach as well. And they're going to have to all work together and see if that's something that they want to do. Because either Bylsma or Leach are going to have to kind of change what they've been doing and what they've been coaching. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. I mean, the big on ice thing, which we can't really talk too much about because they haven't made a move yet, is just the power play and who that other coach is that they're bringing in to kind of be that offensive specialist in the power play, because that's the biggest area they need to address. Francis has said it, Bylsma has said it, the production, the offense, the scoring, the power play. That is the biggest area to try and augment and to change up the coaching approach. And I think there's going to be a pretty significant voice in there that we don't know who it is yet, and they don't know who it is yet.
Yeah, and the other thing offensively is just like systems in the offensive zone, because like I've been mentioning forechecking systems, but even when they have the puck, Dan Bylsma, both in his previous stints, like going back to Pittsburgh days, but also definitely with the Firebirds and a lot of the way Shane Wright has been playing and excelling at the AHL level and stuff, likes to utilize the slot, right? Likes to put players, he likes to have guys go to high percentage scoring areas and then get them the puck, right? Have them sneak behind a defender, have somebody in a good prime setup to then feed them the puck while they are in that spot with a little bit of time and space because they didn't carry the puck there with a bunch of guys on them. He wants to get them into a spot where they're going to have time and space, then get them the puck in a high percentage scoring area, whether it's the slot, kind of down low, in and around the net. He's big about that. And a lot of that is the stuff that I felt like the Kraken were not doing enough last year to try to manufacture goals. They were not going to the areas of the ice where you are more likely to score. And that was a big problem for the offense. You look at a lot of like the individual shot charts for a lot of the Kraken players. Like the big one that I always think of, RJ, is the Matty Beniers shot chart. And it's just very much loaded with, off to the left side, and they weren't really high percentage chances or areas of the ice to be shooting from. I think a lot of that stuff changes with Dan Bylsma just because he understands to score in the National Hockey League. Doesn't matter how talented you are, right? He had Sidney Crosby, and he wanted Sidney Crosby to go to these areas too, because that's where Crosby was going to score more. And I think that's going to be big for this team offensively, in addition to the power play.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it start to get rolled out during training camp too, because it's going to be a fun training camp to watch and kind of see, and preseason to see how the systems all come together, and also have the chance to ask Dan about it a little bit more in detail too, because today it was just completely swamped. We, didn't really have any time to have a secondary conversation or whatever, but as things thin out a little bit during the preseason, kind of ask him about details of that.
Yeah. And it'll also be interesting because, like, I did mention, and he kind of touched on this stuff too, but like part of the issue in Buffalo was that he was too rigid with his system. He was too unwavering based on the personnel he had and what the players kind of felt like their strengths were. So it'll be interesting to also see how things develop over a training camp as he has those players maybe give some of their input too. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see because I you can tell that there's been more emphasis on, say, going to the slot this year with the Firebirds than there even was last year with them. Even though him and the coaching staff has stayed the same, their style has been a little bit more aggressive in the offensive zone, a little bit more down low, get in and around the net, crash all three forwards in and around the net, and go for something there. We didn't see that as much last year with the Firebirds, and I do wonder now, after hearing him speak today, how much of that was the players, right? Maybe being like, hey, we like doing this, so this is what we want to do. And or how much of it was him communicating with them and looking at Shane Wright's game from juniors and what Shane kind of naturally wants to do, and then changing the system to help and benefit him and put him in the best position to succeed because he was their best player, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's going to be interesting to see how all that stuff happens. And all of that is just stuff that we did not have before. That did not happen with the Kraken, like, at all. And so I'm just very excited to kind of see all that go down here under Coach Dan. Any other stuff you want to talk about, RJ? We can kind of just like go into like the end stuff, kind of give our overall thoughts on everything here. I mean, is there what else is there to talk about that's really standing out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of covered the off ice, we covered the on ice. I mean, I do want to look at the big picture. That's kind of next in my notes is just, what is the big picture? I know it probably, what are we at, Dylan? Is how long have we been recording this?
46 minutes. So we're good.
Okay, so probably it sounds like we've just kind of been raving about Coach Dan for 46 minutes, and how we love the hire, and we do love the hire.
Yeah.
But is there anything that kind of gives you pause or hesitation with this? Anything that worries you about next season? Because I do have still plenty of questions and worries about next year. I'm not comfortable saying, oh yeah, they hired Dan, they're back to a 100-point team, they're back in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Let's go, because there's still a lot of work left to be done, I think. But are there any concerns or hesitations that you have?
No, I think the stuff that Dan fixes, and I've said this before, right? Like, he's more of a culture hire than a win now hire, right? Like, I think there was probably better coaches that were going to make them win more games next year, but weren't going to be better for the team in the long run. And obviously the organization, and certainly ownership anyway, valued this more than that. And I think that that's realistically the right thing, because you need to make sure Maddie and Shane really continue to develop. But like, there is going to be stuff like with them figuring out the system, and particularly with maybe some of the guys on the roster. And we saw this last year where there was like some rigidity to the system and guys weren't really able to execute it or whatever. I do wonder, like, it's going to be an aggressive forechecking system. Is everybody going to be able to handle that? Right? Not like, oh, do they want to? Like, they're professional athletes. They should want to, and they should be okay with it. If they don't, then that's a them problem. But if with like, two guys forechecking, like, you've got to really be on it, and you've got to be on it all the time. And it's brutal. And over the course of an 82 game season at the NHL level, it wears on you, and you start making mental mistakes just because, it's a very all in type of thing. How is the team going to be able to handle that? Are they going to be able to handle that? Is it going to lead to too many odd man rushes going the other way as guys are even just figuring it out? Because it's one of those things too, where you got to get used to, if I'm the guy coming in on the puck carrier and then the other guy has to be in that passing lane, how does he know which passing lane to get into, right? You can do some of that stuff through the film room, but a lot of it's just feel. Right, you got to be watching the puck carrier's eyes. Where's his teammates? Where's his outlet? All of that kind of stuff. It's going to have a steep learning curve, and so early season, I could see the team maybe struggle with some of that stuff. Where the defense, as we know, is not the greatest unit in the world, might have to deal with a lot of, say, 4-on-3 opportunities, and how are they going to be able to stand up against that? This is where hopefully Grubauer and Joey Decord come back and have strong seasons again. But I think there's going to be stuff like that at least early season could like maybe raise some red flags for people. But I think that's part of like the overall like, plan. It's just them having to get used to being asked to do things that they haven't been asked to do the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I guess that's a little bit where my concerns lie. Again, still overall happy with everything, but just with that new system, it just feels like a risk reward type of thing with that kind of
Hmm.
forecheck and the effort you have to put in. And I'm just a little bit nervous, not even so much like on Dan's side of it, but just with the players, that if they don't get rewarded for it, because that's a lot of work to put in. And if you're not rewarded for it on the scoreboard, it can
Hmm.
be demoralizing. And they're already at the way this past season finished, they're coming up from it at it from a place of being demoralized because
Yeah.
everybody certainly was at exit interviews when we
Yes.
last saw them. And that I just, I hope that they're able to, if they put in the work, you get rewarded for it, because if not, that's when things could get a little dangerous where you could see the buy-in start to slip, especially with a system like that where you have to work really hard. So I guess that's just kind of my one concern for the on ice thing. Who knows if that'll end up happening that way, but it's just the risk there, I think. As far as the process though, like the interview process and everything, one thing that did stand out to me was Francis said, he's like, I don't like to have an interview unless it's like a serious candidate and I'm really thinking about hiring somebody. And that they did interview only 5 people, 5 names. And I think we can kind of discern at least 4 of them,
Yeah.
probably 5. Do you have an issue with the process? Do you mind that at all? Maybe not casting a wider net.
I mean, I think 5 is an okay number. However, in this case, 2 were internal candidates.
Right.
So that does
So
feel a
only
little
3 external
small.
candidates. Does that?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I had that thought myself, and I think to an extent they were probably kind of zeroed in on Dan, given that's where
Yes.
they ended up going. I have to think, just given the way the process went, in the back of their mind, Dan was probably the leading candidate from the start. And so, maybe you don't bring in 10 other people and because I think at a certain point you kind of get there's this like analysis paralysis, right? Where you
Yeah.
have too many options and different guys. But still, it seemed a little small. I don't want to be too critical of it, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was one of the things I was going to talk about towards the end too, about why I think maybe even the buy-in stuff with the players won't necessarily be as bad, or at least this year. Why they can survive going through this kind of dramatic system shift that they're going to go through this year, and that is because of the experiences that I had late in this season, right? So I went to that final game in LA, and who was sitting in front of me in the press bridge? Well, it was Dan Bylsma. And yes, it was, Shane, Ryan Winterton, Logan Morrison, Riker Evans. They were all playing for the Kraken. You're obviously close to Coachella Valley. It makes sense maybe for him to come out there and see them play and everything. But then he went down and was talking with all of the Kraken players afterwards, right? And he was talking with them around the locker room and everything after the game. And you could tell that, I mean, he held court like more than I have seen in a long time. Somebody hold court. He really held court, and you could just tell based on the look of all these guys' faces. I mean, keep in mind they got eliminated from the playoffs officially that game. They were just all about him. Everybody wanted to hear from Coach Stan that was on this Kraken team. They were all in on him, and so that left an impression. And then I fly up on Friday for the watch party for the Ducks game, right? I fly up there, and who do I run into at the airport? Well, it's Dan Bylsma. And at first I was like, wait a second, what is going on here? And I realized, well, they're going up to Abbotsford to play over the weekend. But he'd come into town obviously a day early and was going to talk with the Kraken people at KCI. I could tell that much from the interaction. And so we had talked about it at the time, and it was probably like, well, he's just checking in. It made sense for him to be there on that Wednesday to watch the game in LA because all those Firebirds guys were there and he can kind of root and cheer for them. And then, it makes sense that he would check in just as the coach coming through town or passing by town, right? It makes sense for him to stop in and kind of give a report on everything. But now, given the context of everything, including the fact that they had such a narrow coaching search, I do wonder how much of that was like a soft interview process, where it was, at that point, if again, Ron Francis said they were all about results. It wasn't about exit interviews with Dave Haxtell. It was just about the results. At that point, the results of that season were known. I do wonder how much of that was they maybe had him there for a Kraken game, view some things, talk with some players, maybe get his opinion on what's going on and what they can maybe do to fix things next year. When he had that meeting with them up there in Seattle, and then that would just act as like an early interview.
Mhm. Yeah, in hindsight, it certainly does raise some of those questions. And yeah, I mean, I think soft interview is probably a good way to describe it, potentially. But again, these are conversations that, like, I would hope that the communication in the organization is just a
Yeah.
constant kind of daily thing anyway. But it doesn't hurt to be able to kind of meet in face to face in person and kind of
Yeah.
exchange ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it would certainly just be more instances of them talking and him, looking good in their eyes, right? Like if he is saying or his reporting from Coachella Valley or whatever, or on those players that again are going to be key pieces and maybe pieces they knew were going to be on this roster next year beyond Shane and Riker, but like Logan Morris and Ryan Winterton, and he's talking about how they were under him in Coachella Valley and what he's seeing from them at the NHL level. That would go a long way for, say, Ron Francis, if he's already trying to look at what his roster is going to look like next year, and he's like, oh, he's noticing these things about these guys at the NHL level, what they need to work on, what else. I could see that making just a big impression, even if it's just part of the normal communication between a minor league coach and the general manager.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. And anything else you want to talk about, specific topics and
No, I mean that's really it. I mean, if we want,
I have one more big picture question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I mean, knowing kind of who was generally available, like, because this is the question I kept coming back to is, is there somebody out there we would have rather had them hire that was available and realistic? And I don't know that there is.
No, I don't think that there is. Again, I agree. Like if it is like a management decision or an ownership decision to go with, development and the longer term approach, I think that's more realistically where this team was at. And I think that was the appropriate course of action. I think Dan is the absolute,
talked about it 2 weeks ago.
Best, that Dan is the absolute best person for that, particularly because he has already worked with so many of the guys like Shane Wright that you're going to need to step up and become legit, high tier NHL players. I just think that this all made sense for so many reasons. And then also the personality aspect that I talked about earlier. You're trying to grow the fan base. You're going to be more accessible. You want to have be more of a personal connection from the management coaching side of things with the community and the fan base. Like he just checks every box that it seems like this franchise has wanted from this kind of sort of culture shift that they're going for this offseason. The one thing you can't do is add more talent to the team. But no coach was going to be able to, right? It's not like coaches come with players built in. And I think just the fact that he has already worked with Shane and made Shane a better player and made guys like Logan Morrison, Ty Cartier, Ryan Winterton better players, Riker Evans, he's got more of that than any other candidate would have had. So, yeah, I'm totally on board, and I think it is realistically the best that they could have done.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Francis, so he made his hire. I think it's a good hire. And now he's got to go and do the more difficult job of adding talent to that roster, because as good a hire as I think this is, it's not going to matter if they can't increase the talent on the roster. We saw that last year. A coach can only do so much. And so I think now is the even more interesting part of the offseason to see how they can solve that bigger challenge. But I think they have a coach in place who's certainly capable of getting the most out of the talent. And now the real hard work comes as far as just building up that roster, and we'll see what Francis is able to come up with.
Yeah, like I said earlier, they're 2 for 3 so far in the offseason, right? They did the TV deal that kind of needed to happen for the organization. They got in the new coach and the kind of the new culture that they want, and I think is going to be good. Now it's just about making the roster better. And arguably it's the most important one of all of those, but it's going to be the toughest, and it's going to be all on Ron Francis and his front office to make it happen. And I can't wait to see what they've got in store over the next. I mean, realistically, we're going to have to wait a little while because we got to wait for the draft and free agency.
Yeah,
but,
wait about a month.
Yeah, so it's going to be a long wait, but I'm very excited to see how they do. But right now, it just feels good that, like I said, they're 2 for 3. Like this offseason has been perfect so far for the organization and everything that they needed to address after a brutal year.
Definitely. And we'll see if we can keep it rolling.
Yep, definitely. Just like everybody can keep it rolling at Queen Anne Beer Hall, whether you're there for all the wonderful beers they got on tap or the great food like the giant pretzel. Oh my gosh, I got to get up there in July. I'm coming up in July. I got to get a pretzel again, RJ. It's time.
Camp Pretzels, let's go.
I can't handle this whole like quarterly pretzel thing. I need it more frequently than that. It's just not enough.
For sure.
So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks to them for sponsoring the podcast. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you all next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons.
Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.